Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelco. I have the good fortune of chairing today's meeting. Was many years here as the director of the Environmental Change and Security Program. Thrilled to still be partnering with Lauren Herzer and colleagues as a senior advisor to that program, which is approaching 25 years, trying to bring these issues of environment security together. Chad's been along on that journey for many of those years, as well as we look at the multiple dimensions of energy, environment, foreign policy, and security policy in particular. And today's book launch is no exception to that endeavor, that the Wilson Center, as a formal memorial to President Wilson, he was our only president to have a PhD, so Congress decided to set up a living memorial where the worlds of scholarship and policy could come together for exactly this kind of interaction, so they could those fields could learn from one another and try to improve endeavors in research and in practice. And so that's our job today for those of us here in the room, for those folks watching online and watching the archive video that we hope you will avail yourselves on in the Wilson Center webpage. So today it's a distinct pleasure to welcome back to the Wilson Center Dr. Chad Briggs, to welcome to the Wilson Center Dr. Miriam Matejova, and then she's sitting here, Sherry Goodman. It's back to the Wilson Center, but she's a fellow here as well. And so it's a terrific lineup, one that we'll jump right into it after kind of short introduction, and to say that this really reflects the insights of many, many years of tackling these issues from, we'll call it the front lines, I guess, and we're talking security metaphors. But Chad Briggs is now the new graduate director and associate professor of public policy at University of Alaska, Anchorage, right? Just starting?
Yes, I haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, he's on his way, so Europe and stop here and then just keep going. He's also the strategy director at Global Int LLC. He has a lot of time working in and with the Government Department of Energy in particular. He's a Minerva Chair and professor looking at environment security at the Air University down at Maxwell Air Force Base. He's just spent 4 years teaching and working these issues in Kosovo and in southeastern Europe, where a number of us here in the room are heading to shortly. So we appreciate his insights very much on that area as well. And he's really somebody who has been doing lots of projects that lead into the practical insights in the book that he's presenting today. So this is not something that's coming out of an ivory tower. It's very much from working it. And Miriam, the same, is I think collaborating with Chad in part with the same interests and the same approach. She's an economic advisor at Canada's Ministry of Environment. She's a Vanier Scholar, Killam Laureate, Luce Scholar, and most previously a Kovler Fellow at the Kennedy Presidential Library. And so it's a thrill to hear about, also always interesting to hear how the collaborations on books worked, because it's a feat to bring them to fruition. So look forward to hearing about that. And then Sherry Goodman, who on these issues really needs no introduction. She's our former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, a pioneer in both the thinking and the doing in the environment and security space. We're very pleased and lucky to have her here at the Wilson Center sharing insights and her leadership in how we tackle these issues in a variety of locations and from a variety of angles. And so Sherry's very kindly agreed to make some discussant comments after Chad and Miriam present the book. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chad. I will say, as a preview for instructions for Q&A, we'll save your questions until all three speakers have had a chance to speak. And then when we do that, we'll ask you to wait for a microphone to ask your question so those folks online can hear what you're asking. So I think I'm throwing it to Chad. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you, Jeff. First, my apologies. I have a bit of a sore throat, so if I start fading out, I'll just hand over to Miriam. It's the good thing about having a co-author who knows as much as I do about the book, because then I can absolve myself of responsibility. No, it's great to be here. It's a great coincidence that Jeff and I are in town at the same time. yeah, Jeff and I knew each other from the long time ago. I don't want to admit how long ago that was. When I was a graduate student, but the sort of 1990s version of environmental security. Back when I was reading speeches by a certain Deputy Undersecretary of Defense. And the book really came out of work that started in some ways in the Balkans in looking at post-conflict reconstruction. And we were trying to figure out a way to do assessments, how to do risk assessments when there are no data available, and how to scale up, how to give some sort of guidance to policymakers in a way that they would know, okay, this is a good place to put money, this is not a good place, here are the consequences to some of your actions. And I started doing vulnerability assessments, and this came very quickly to the attention of certain people in the Department of Energy, who then introduced me to other people in the Department of Energy. And before I knew it, I was working directly in that sphere with some of the most intelligent people I'd ever met, and asking these very, very simple, basic questions. What does climate change mean for security, and how do we figure it out and then communicate it to policymakers? And by the way, we don't have much money, but figure this out within the next couple months because we need reports back to the Secretary right away. So this was like heady days of early 2009, and we did some really good work. It was hard because we were bootstrapping. A lot of what we describe in the book then is talking about methodologies that don't require a lot of money or a lot of background because we didn't have these multi-million-dollar projects. You know, we weren't working for like Booz Allen with a $100 million contract where we can set up this whole consortium, or not to point out any defense contractors in particular.
Hypothetically.
By way of admission, I did work with General Dynamics for a time, so but they were very nice. And eventually this project morphed. Then there was a lot of academic politics into it, and this is something that Miriam and I write about. In the sense that this work didn't really belong at universities, it didn't belong in the intelligence community, it didn't belong in the military. No one really knew who should take over this because it broke all the rules in different places about what should be done. We didn't follow university rules for waiting until we had full certainty for all information before publishing it. Our point was to go out and talk to scientists long before they published and just ask them, okay, well, what really worries you? What's the stuff that you know but you can't publish yet because you're talking about potential abrupt changes that we can't prove until after they happen? It didn't fit with the intelligence community because we wanted to talk to people without classifying issues. We didn't want to come up with long contact lists of, okay, well, which country are you from? I need to put this on the list and report back to my boss. And so I should also say that this, when we write about secrecy in the book, was also why some of my DoD colleagues joke that I was reverse compartmentalized, that I was deliberately kept from having a security clearance. And then when we eventually moved to the Air Force, even though that was just standard, everyone would at least have a secret clearance, we said, no, this just won't work. And the point is that anytime that I would reach out to the scientists, I needed to promise to them that we're going to share this information, that the scenarios that we describe in this book, when we were working on them, we had to say, okay, we're not just going to take data from you, because then otherwise they wouldn't give it to us. But we're going to work together, and you'll be able to shepherd the data. You'll be able to tell us what are the implications, what are the consequences of this. You'll be able to explain a lot of the uncertainties. And then by doing that, I could also publish things right away without going through the security reviews, which in certain political environments could be a little dicey sometimes. Yeah. Not that this would ever happen in a city like DC. So eventually this went to the Air Force, and much of what the book describes then is work that happened almost 10 years ago, U.S. Department of Energy and then at the Air Force. Some of it continued when I left for Eastern Europe in Ukraine, and Miriam as well worked on some of these issues in Ukraine. And that's why you have this really, at first glance, bizarre chapter that combines geoengineering and Ukraine in the same thing. But they fit in just the sense that we didn't want to look just at a lot of the framing is in terms of how natural systems will, for example, cause conflict. And I remember from the 1990s, and in fact, Jeff was one of the guys who was arguing, wait, that's not always the framing, right? You can have environmental cooperation as well. Or you can have conflict causing problems or environmental damages. So we wanted to emphasize that it's not just about climate change. That's a really important factor, but it's there in the background. Human actions as well are really important. These aren't just natural disasters. These depend upon human actions and human vulnerabilities. And as well, we didn't want to say that these are just natural forces that cause things that we can't control. Because at DoD, we agreed that, one, that made it a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. That if we thought that we're only going to look at how environmental changes cause conflict, we're missing all the alternate pathways. And we're missing everything that happens below the violent conflict level to refugees, to communities, all the human security aspects. And we didn't want to lose sight of that, because in looking at early warning, those were really important components. And secondly, we were afraid that we would be overselling the issue a bit too much. That there was one point in the book in which I described going to a general and describing, okay, here's some of the water conflicts, potential water conflicts between China and India. And they'd asked us to write about that. And he looked over it and thought, okay, this makes sense. Yeah, this is important. And let's list this as number 39 out of reasons that China and India might go to war with one another. There are plenty of reasons, right? But this is only one of them. And so we have to contextualize all of this stuff. It's important, but if you only focus at violent conflict, and especially state conflict, you lose sight of so much else. And so that's why we really wanted to get better resolution of everything that was happening on lower levels. And the best way of doing that was creating scenarios, of creating ideas of not what will happen, but what might happen. And trying to create scenarios in a way that we do counterintuitive, let's talk about things that aren't normally mixed together. We had a really good example of a US Army colonel who mixed together earthquakes with nuclear power and epidemic illness in California. And came up with a really good way of explaining how all of these things are tied together. And likewise, we would come up with scenarios that we ran one in Kosovo this summer, which was trying to link like pandemic flu outbreaks with tsunamis. Because these things can happen together. And often we see disasters, they don't just happen in single sort of hazards, right? But you get multiple things that can happen at once. And by doing that, we could stress test systems. We could find where the vulnerabilities were. And in identifying where those vulnerabilities were, we could communicate then to policymakers and say, look, your energy grid is dependent upon this one import here. Or your human systems are fairly stable, but if you lose this water grid, everything else goes. And we found that was usually where people tended to listen to us the most. If we just came up with some grand scheme or just some sort of correlative data, for example, we had researchers once, not our researchers, but we had another researcher who said, we've done all of this study, DoD has funded us for this, and we found out that when it rains more, there's a higher chance of conflict. Okay, maybe that's interesting, but if you don't know the pathways for that, if you can't explain or regionally apply it, and Tracy, my wife, who was also directly involved in the Minerva project, actually raised her hand at one point and then was saying, why is that useful to us? You know, it really putting the grill on and saying, from a practical point of view, yeah, that may be an academic study, but practically speaking, what do? Okay, it's raining more, we put people on alert. It's not raining, and we could just sit back now? So a lot of this was really based on, as Jeff said, needing to translate this stuff practically, of always having someone on our team who would, as we say, red team it, who would come back and say, that's interesting, but no one's going to care about that at the Pentagon. Or that's a good point, but you need to sell it a little bit differently because those people aren't going to be interested in this facet of security. And that was good for us because we could come up with great ideas and maybe some things would sell at the university, but to get back to the policymakers, that often took a lot of translation. And that was really a difficult thing. If you wanted to ask about collaboration, I could point out. Now, Miriam, I met 8.5 years ago in Wales at an intelligence conference. Some people had asked why Tracy wasn't the co-author. I should point out that Tracy is my wife. We're happily married. We wanted to stay happily married. You don't live in the same place as your co-author. We did that with the Air Force. It worked well, but it was very traumatic. I was just happy that I had a colleague who I'd already worked with. She'd helped us on some of these Air Force issues, and also just happens to be an excellent researcher and has the same writing style I have. So I challenge any of you who have a copy of the book to actually point out which part she wrote and which part I wrote, because it wouldn't be easy. But this was a long-distance collaboration, though. I haven't seen her since
Oxford.
Yeah, beginning of February of last year, when we were still in the midst of writing the book. So it was challenging in a way, but I think it worked out. And it's always good to have someone with a slightly different perspective and expertise, even though we didn't have quite a few things in common. But if Miriam, maybe you could say a few things about just how we viewed the idea of disasters in terms of what was wrong with using historical records, and why the need for scenarios then.
Okay. I wasn't expecting you to ask me to do that.
Yeah, you're jumping into the Q&A.
Okay, so maybe just to get back to the collaboration a little bit. So my bio says that I work for Canada's Ministry of the Environment, which I do, but I'm not here on the official Canadian government business. So I really feel like I need to point that out. So my government work is very much unrelated to this work that I've been doing with Chad for about 9 years now. Okay, so maybe since you already explained kind of the background, I can jump into this problem with historical data or records and traditional assessments. So this is something that I've always had problem with, and it wasn't until I met Chad that he pointed out why. A lot of us, and certainly in traditional risk assessments, people look at the future as simply a continuation of the past. So the future is very much going to look like the past did, maybe a little bit different, but we often have this idea of everything moving in a linear way, linear sense, and that's problematic when we have abrupt environmental changes occurring because they're by definition not linear. So if we encounter events that we don't have historical data on, that have never happened before, we get frozen by the sudden uncertainty. We don't know how to deal with things that we have never had to deal with before. And in those cases, this idea of linearity completely falls apart. So we're frozen by uncertainty. And then we don't take actions until we get enough information that we can move on. But in many cases, once we actually do get enough information and move on, it's too late. And then we have to deal with consequences.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that what you meant?
Yes, sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh, that's fine, that's fine. You should have told me that before, but
Terrific. Well, Sherry, can we give you an opportunity to reflect from the perspective of someone who has been both the instigator and the consumer of the work that brings these things together in scenarios and role playing and wargaming?
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you for your leadership in this field and for being the founding director of the Environmental Change and Security Program, and here when it was in the Castle, I think.
That's right. Yep.
And this was underway 20 plus years ago now. And Chad, and for your work in this field, and now with Miriam and others in the room. So let's start out with why do we do scenarios and war games for military planning and intelligence assessment it's really to test out different theories of how an event will unfold, right? So you don't want to go into battle not knowing what the possibilities are of confrontation with the enemy. So that's sort of the basic sort of history of why wargaming and scenarios have been used in military planning and intelligence assessment. What's newer in the last decade or so is bringing this traditional field together with the emerging field of environmental security. And that's what Chad and Miriam have recounted in this book, very aptly named Disaster Security. So I want to make really 5 points about this work in this field that I think are important to sort of put this in context. The first is the important connection between, and as Miriam just said, we now live in a world where the historical record of environmental change isn't accurate to predict the future. So part of the main reason we do scenarios and war games is to be able to understand how the future might unfold, knowing full well that no plan ever really met its first encounter with the enemy. So, a plan is just that. It's a plan, but you have to plan in order to be prepared. So, recognizing that the environmental historical record isn't accurate any longer in the climate era because weather is not the same, temperature is not the same, and you can't rely on it to predict what was a 100-year flood and it is now an every year or every other year flood. It's very critical to connect the science as it's changing with the security and intelligence analysis. And I would say this is still really a new and evolving field. And that's why the stories that Chad and Miriam tell about their work are so significant. And that's why a lot of what my work and others here has been about putting this together. Those of you who are sort of entering this field will find, I think, that is one of the ways that you can make a difference. In fact, let me ask just who in the room who's a scientist? Who's got a physical science background? Okay. Who's got a national security background? All right. An intelligence background? Okay, we have a really actually good mix. Okay, well, that's great. And that's what this field, and there's probably other disciplines in here I haven't called out. Of course, we could break each of them down into their own subfields. But that's what this area really calls for, is integrated assessment. We actually have several projects underway here at Wilson in different forms where we're trying to attack that problem. One with Lauren. I know Lauren, Herzer, and Amanda are here somewhere in the room. I saw them. Okay, Lauren and Amanda, thank you both for what you do. Amanda actually got all this stuff together here. Lauren leads the Environmental Change and Security Program. We have one project where we're working on improving predictive capabilities for disruptive weather and water events, bringing together scientists with national security planners. We have another related project that works on resilient Arctic infrastructure, which brings scientists doing work on Arctic change with engineers with infrastructure needs in the Arctic. And then we have a related one looking at Arctic 2050 scenarios, where we're trying to use some scenarios to actually bring together the scientists and the planners in the same room as part of Arctic 2050, which is going to be held here, Arctic Search 2050, which will be here at Wilson in September. So that's one, and I'm sure there are that's a set of things we're doing, but there's other things out there as well. My second point is the really critical thing is to be able to move from the post-conflict reconstruction, which is where you started your work, Chad, and where we have improved our capability to reconstruct how environmental factors or drought, climate have affected conflicts in the past. The most off-sided example is how the underlying droughts in Syria were a factor in that voracious conflict and led through a series of events, from herders and farmers not being able to conduct their livelihoods, to migrate to the cities, which led to civil unrest, which then created, the tinder of flame for which the insurgents and others could take advantage of vulnerable populations and create the deadliest conflict of our time. So that has been done as sort of a post-conflict reconstruction. We didn't know in advance of the Syrian conflict that the drought was going to be a source of tension and unrest. To improve foresight and predictive planning so that we can better anticipate how drought and other environmental change could lead to unrest, and then ideally act to prevent it in advance. There are systems like the Famine Early Warning System, and there are emerging other systems that help us better understand where a drought might occur and be able to deploy humanitarian assistance if there's political will and sufficient capital to abate that famine. The sort of next wave of challenge will be to use that type of predictive planning to marshal not only a humanitarian assistance or famine relief, but more of a whole of government response that might include military forces, but really probably as a last resort, but might marshal more rapid diplomatic humanitarian assistance or development response. Okay, that was the second. But the third value of this work is to reveal sort of under-addressed risks in the system. Because often what you think, we're always accused of planning for the last war. So, now since 9/11, we've been doing a lot of planning for the next terrorist attack, and we're a more terror-ready nation. In the last decade, we've done a lot of planning for cyber threats. And we're probably not yet a sufficient cyber-ready nation by any means, but we have a much higher level of awareness of cyber risks. I think we still are at the phase where we've sort of under-addressed as a society environmental risks of a variety of types. I think probably right now in this era, businesses and state and local governments are moving forward faster than the federal government. Not that there aren't pockets of excellence throughout our federal government, there are. But these unrevealed risks can often be brought forward through planning and exercises. One that I have some experience with, which was very common, which was very commonly made aware of about 10, 15 years ago now, was the role of energy in military logistics. For years and years, decades, whenever we do a military war plan, we have to assume we have to have a plan for how you're going to get fuel to the front. Well, we always assumed that energy was available, freely available. It was just there. You didn't actually have to assume that it might be disrupted. Well, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we often learn the hard way that fuel convoys can be targeted by IEDs, improvised explosive devices, improvised explosive devices, and that lives can be put at risk by soldiers driving trucks to the front, and that, the cost of fuel is very expensive, and maybe there are cheaper ways to, power tents and provide water to troops at the front, and not only cheaper, but more sustainable than plastic water bottles. So that was this whole idea of factoring energy into war planning as a variable is now common, but it was not 10 to 15 years ago. We are at that place now with environmental factors, which haven't yet been regularly included into scenarios and exercises. But you can begin to see the evidence, as Chad and Miriam have recounted, where that's happening. The fourth point is that all this work can help planners to sort of mainstream these ideas. And that's where I think the work of people in the research community combined with practitioners and in a multidisciplinary way can really help. And that's sort of the next that's the next mountain to climb in this area and to mainstream these efforts. And lastly, I would say that all of it helps to bring attention to these environmental security connections in a variety of ways. We still need to elevate attention to it. There's both the side of the over-politicization of these issues, or failure to recognize climate change as a forcing factor or as a threat multiplier. But then there's also being able to marshal the evidence and the interdisciplinary connections to get below the rhetoric and to make the real connections and to ensure that you're making decisions based on sound evidence and informed by strategic use of these types of planning scenarios. So thank you both for your contribution to this field. I think it's excellent, and hopefully it's a timely contribution to help move these efforts forward.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Sherry. I think may take the liberty of asking a couple questions, and then we'll open it up. Chad, maybe it'd be useful to walk us through the outlines of one of the scenarios from the book, one of the places where you guys drill down to give us some kind of things to hang on in with a specific case. Could you do that for us?
Okay. The one we usually describe is Hawaii, partly because it was often my favorite. It was definitely a good assignment. But as I sort of point out in the book, it wasn't even really our main responsibility. So much of what we describe in the book is only like a small slice of what our team was really doing with the Air Force. And that was partly a reflection of priorities. It was partly a reflection of expectations that we would do traditional assessments, but then we found that traditional assessments were being ignored. But Trace and I, when we were going around the island of Oahu, and the University of Hawaii was introducing us to different scientists, we went to the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology and then asked, like I'd said before, the question, okay, well, what keeps you guys up at night? What really worries you? And the answer that they gave at that institute was to describe how even a small change, 0.5 degree Celsius change in sea surface temperature around the Hawaiian Islands, would change the ocean currents enough that it would change the high pressure system that traditionally existed around the Hawaiian Islands. And that this existence of the high pressure system was what kept tropical storms from generally diverting around the Hawaiian Islands. So the last major tropical storm landing that they'd had before that time was Hurricane Iniki back in 1991. So the islands just weren't prepared for tropical storms because they just never really experienced them. Like Miriam said, historically it just wasn't on the record. But here we'd found a really, really marginal change, which translated into something else, which left open a vulnerability. And so we started asking the question, okay, well, what if tropical storms start hitting the island? So we worked with the University of Hawaii to come up with a scenario workshop. And we had different working groups, and we'd work on different geographic scales. So we had one group that worked on sort of a pan-Pacific scale of different scenarios and different combinations of things. We had one group that looked at all the Hawaiian Islands, and we had one group, my group, that looked specifically just at Oahu. And that group that looked just at Oahu, it was surprising how just even that one island with 1 million people on it was so vulnerable because no one had thought of it as being vulnerable before. We found that 95% of the island's electricity came from diesel fuel, which was imported into only one port, which, of course, is right at sea level, and was uniquely vulnerable to any number of different storm tracks. All the food was imported into Sand Island, which, as the name implies, is not just an island, but also quite low. And so we came up with a number of different scenarios, combinations of heavy rains followed by tropical storms, 2 tropical storms hitting after one another, tropical storm followed by a tsunami. And under any one of those scenarios, we found the same outcomes over and over again. And in terms of complex systems, this meant it was a strong attractor. This meant that no matter what the combination of factors, we were going to be stressing these critical nodes. And in military terms, right, a critical node is a system by which if you take it out, it's a component of a system by which if you take it out, the rest of the system starts to degrade and doesn't work anymore. And it was really quite frightening because we figured out that, look, island of 1 million people, 3,000 miles from the coast, and you only have 3 days supply of food and energy. That's really not a very good combination of factors. And then when we started looking at the state disaster plans, then we'd find out that they really came up against what we were assuming. So the basic state disaster plan, for example, would say that Waikiki, which under all of our scenarios would be flooded, they said, well, this is where we're going to move all of the first responders. We're going to, because we'll move the tourists out, and then we'll just move all the first responders and humanitarian workers, and we'll move them into the hotels in Hawaii. And we're like, well, how can you do that? Because it's flooded. You have no way of moving the tourists out in the first place because the airport's flooded too. So what's really going to happen? And that really started to raise a lot of questions, and for which we don't take all the credit, but we'd like to take just a little bit to say that, there was a bigger discussion in the state of Hawaii then about use of renewable energy. Because at the time that we were there in 2012, we'd do aerial reconnaissance of the island, and the only solar panels you would see would be on military housing and on Walmart. But the state utility it really discouraged any individual households from feeding into the grid. But we pointed out, this is your future, right? This is what you need to do, because otherwise you're leaving yourself vulnerable. And it was only about a year after, well, it was 2 months after we came up with that scenario that Hurricane Sandy happened, which then really highlighted a lot of the risks for tropical storms to the US. And about a year after that, in which the first tropical storm started hitting Hawaii then. And I think the first time it happened, it was just as we had planned in the scenario, not as a prediction, but just as a what if, right? And a lot of people were saying, no, that's improbable. But it was a 1-2 punch. It was one tropical storm hitting after another. And that was the one scenario that really got everyone's attention. So people in the National Security Council, people in the National Intelligence Council, people, they would really start saying, okay, everyone was talking about climate security before, but this is what brings it home. Because it's not just off in some far-off place. It's not just people in Syria fighting with one another. It's not people we don't know on low-lying islands in the Pacific. These are our islands. And they also realized, at least from a practical point of view, that if anything happened with a humanitarian disaster in Hawaii, didn't matter what else the U.S. military was doing. They were prepared, by and large. But they would be diverting all their resources to the disaster response, right? So it wasn't good for the military either. And as much as Hawaiian Island, Oahu is like the crown jewel of U.S. security in the Pacific, they really didn't want to disrupt, and that really, I think, fired up people's imagination a lot more.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask then, either of you, have you seen a difference in greater openness from these civilian, we'll say public, whether it's environment or planning or the kind of governor's office and such, a greater willingness to see the insights and the approaches from the military as something that is appropriate? Because I think part of what, and maybe this is the long view, but part of the battle has been when you bring that actor to the table with a tool, the toolbox was assumed use of force, good at breaking things, mismatched, or at least a tool of last resort, right? As opposed to a much more heterogeneous understanding of the different tools that the military uses, and so then that there's a lot to take from it. And so do you see that change in evolution with a kind of more nuanced understanding of how many different tools are in the toolbox coming from the security community? And is there greater kind of partnerships or willingness to pull that in and integrate that kind of planning and scenario work as opposed to seeing them as a really separate enterprise?
I can jump in. I just thought of a couple of examples or areas. So one, we have presented at a couple of conferences, academic conferences, and I found it difficult to sell this idea of mixing research and science with policy impacts and policy implications, even though that's I believe that's what academia is supposed to do. But I always found that when we presented the scenario work and taking military strategies and applying them elsewhere, that there was resistance. And then we tried to apply this in Canada, and that was unsuccessful. And I'm not quite, well, I mean, the political environment wasn't conducive to this kind of cooperation back in the day. And then we kind of gave up on Canada, but not forever.
Yeah, well, we were just talking about windows of opportunity and when something was ripe, so the time wasn't right. Yeah.
Well, and it's difficult. I mean, there are people who still see military involvement in the environment as necessarily wrong. And there's a strong academic bias against that, at least with certain generations. And I understand it. I mean, when I first started with this work, I remember sitting down with Simon Dalby and asking this question about, well, what's the moral hazard here? Like, should I really be involved in this? Because what am I getting myself into? His response is, well, this is just too damn important now, and use whatever you can. But there was an article that just came out, I think 2 days ago in Vox that was talking about how we shouldn't have climate security because the military is just a polluter, and it is a polluter. And being part of the Air Force, I was very aware of that. I mean, we couldn't ask certain questions about mitigation because that meant less fuel used, which means pilots fly fewer hours, and you don't want to ask questions about that. Those are still important questions to ask, but at least for starting, we wanted to start with the adaptation and early warning questions. What I did find, though, was that a lot of scientists, individually anyway, not the universities, because on an organizational level, there'd be pushback and there'd be resistance. But on individual level, a lot of scientists really wanted to work on this because they were frustrated, especially younger scientists. Like younger scientists who said, this is what I work on, and no one's listening to me. And if you have a way that this can get translated into something useful and can get that communicated, then that's great. But they have to follow the academic line of this is my research. I can't go too far beyond that without my chair coming down and saying, this is inappropriate for you to start talking about all these political issues. But they understand the political issues. If they're doing environmental research, they understand the consequences of what it is they're researching. But only the really senior people, the Michael Manns of the world, get to speak freely with it. Well, even he gets into trouble. But.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Why don't we open it up? I have more, but I don't want to monopolize. Open up the opportunity for folks in the audience to ask questions. If you could let us know who you are and ask a question. We'll bring a microphone over. Of course, the usual proviso that we're interested in questions and not full-on speeches. And so please, gentlemen in the middle.
My name is Sean Griffin. I'm president of Disaster Intelligence. That's relevant.
Absolutely.
I would argue that we've done a lot of scenario planning in my community, so I don't think that's not a shortage of it. What I'd be interested in is understanding how have you provided greater context through your scenario planning so that folks have a better understanding of what is potentially at risk, so that it creates a call to action. Because I think the issues that have been challenges has been more problem admiration than problem solving, because these risks are too unbounded and very difficult to wrap your brain around. So how have you brought context to the decision maker to make better policy decisions?
Can I ask a question in part, because this is one that I had. Would you see your question in part as this, we have tools and such for early warning. What we are missing is the early action or the response. Is that in part what you're getting at, or how do you break through so that you get some of that response as well?
Well, so I served as director of incident management at the National Security Council. So I worked with Alice Hill and on these resilience issues. So very much experience there. We plan for the responses. That's not the issue. I think the problem is it's not the immediate response. We do that well. It's the long-term risk issues. 100 years out, this is what the National Climate Assessment looks like. How do we get people to think about and provide context to mitigating against the risks for these longer-term challenges, apparently, or not apparently, but especially because the fact that they're so far out that it's hard for people to grasp that this is the future, in the near term, but also in the very long term.
The temporal, yeah, okay, great.
Well, one answer to this, and Miriam, if you have anything else, yeah, first of all, we're not saying that no one else did this scenario work, because we knew that there was great work being done at FEMA and other places. The difference, one of the differences with what we were doing was involving different people in the scenario planning process. So one of the frustrations was that when we ran through simulations or war games, or we presented scenarios to people, the scientists especially would often fight back, right? They would be resistant, especially if you black boxed it. If, you know, because people would come back and they'd say, well, why are you assuming this? Why are you assuming sea level rise is going to be this? You know, who told you, or where was the reference for this? But if they were involved in the process from the beginning, and it wasn't just scientists, we would get our scenario planning processes would often be like wedding planning, and you know, we'd have weird combinations of like fighter pilot sitting next to volcanologist sitting next to nuclear emergency manager, but all of them working together. It was something they created, and that was the context for them. Like, it wasn't just the story; it was the fact that they told the story, and so it was something they owned. And rather than fight against it, or just sort of sit back and say, okay, we're just going to have to accept this and then we'll work with it, they created the scenario in the first place, and then we could go from there into the simulations and the war games. But it was so much more real to them because they understood everything that went into it because they were involved in creating it in the first place. So that was, and that wasn't like us being brilliant and thinking intentionally, oh yeah, we need to have this inclusive process. It's just, it was one thing that we just discovered as we went along.
I was thinking exactly the same thing.
Okay.
So the scenario creation workshops have had a lot of different experts around the round tables and that was the beauty and the magic of it, was that we got different people from different fields, different scientists, different researchers, policymakers, practitioners, whoever we could think of, and also get them together, or get people together who would not necessarily meet otherwise, or would not match on paper, because then they had to talk to each other and they had to challenge each other while also working towards the same goals. They had to create these scenarios together, and if they didn't match on paper, well, the better. So that process, that creative process, when they had to challenge each other and work together at the same time, and like Chad said, that makes people, like it involves people, and it makes them feel that it's their project, and then they're more inclined to believe it, and then to be more engaged, and then maybe to take it and go up the chain, depending who was part of it.
Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. My name is Byrne Smith, and I'm here just a private citizen. I'm retired, so I can do that. I have a follow-up to your question, and it sounds to me like communication is potentially your biggest single issue overall, and I'll flesh that out a little bit. Last year, I went to a science cafe talk by the local meteorologist, the local weather dude in Omaha. And he talked for a couple of hours, and it was brilliant from beginning to end. It was astonishing, great science that's being done. But he plucked out a couple of things about communication, which really went to the heart of what he was trying to do. One of them was a friend of his who was a scientist, had just moved to Houston in 2017, just before Hurricane Harvey. And a week before Harvey was scheduled to hit, she contacted him and said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Get out." She didn't get out. Every single day for the rest of the week, he told her to get out. He told her 8 times. She didn't get out. She got stuck. She almost died. He then went on to say that in Omaha, where stuff happens with weather, as we know this year, it's massive. It's still flooding in Omaha now. His estimate is that it takes 8 times to tell someone to do the right thing about their own safety, their own family's safety, in regard to bad weather that happens in Omaha every winter, and sometimes in the summer. Communicating with people you already know, who are part of your own community, is apparently massively difficult in situations like this. So how do we get around that?
That was one of our biggest challenges. In fact, it's something we wrote about in the book because it wasn't a main focus, but we had more or less anticipated Hurricane Sandy. And I'm not saying as in we're proud of that. It's just, yeah, we published it because it was something that I wanted to give context to people. So that's part of your answer. It was like I was trying to visualize to people, okay, well, it's not just New Orleans. What if this happens in Manhattan? And I get pushback from people saying, oh, come on, this is not going to happen in Manhattan. And I said, no, look, we've modeled it. This is exactly what would happen. And generally, people didn't listen. And when it did happen, so when Hurricane Sandy occurred, and I had a student, one of my former students from Lehigh, warned me like a week in advance. Okay, this is probably going to happen. And I have a number of my former students from Lehigh here. So like a bunch of you were at the campus on Lehigh when Hurricane Sandy happened. And Lehigh had this reputation of not shutting down campus under bad weather events. And I was hearing, so I was like writing to the university president saying, look, this is my job for the US Air Force. Close the damn campus. You know, you guys are going to get hit really hard. And yeah, it's remarkable that you can give like the most precise and the most accurate warnings. And yet people, even that you know, won't necessarily listen to you. Partly, though, that I think that's a psychological defense people have of not wanting to believe it. So there was another time in Pennsylvania when, you know, I'm doing all this work for DOE. I'm supposed to be like this team leader for climate change and security. And my local neighbor, who is not a meteorologist or a climate scientist or anything like that, is arguing against me and to say, no, we're not going to worry about climate change. We're not going to worry about climate. And I was just trying to figure out, like, what's his motivation? Why is he trying to argue with me? And then it just clicked, because as he was saying this, he kept looking at his granddaughter. And I realized that was the barrier. He couldn't imagine that the world was going to get so bad for his granddaughter in the way that I was describing. And I had a little bit of sympathy for that then, but I didn't have a really good solution at the same time, right? Unless we present it not just in terms of warnings, because what the risk psychologists will tell you is that if you just present a warning, people will push back. If you present a warning coupled with a very simple solution, now under your example, the solution might have been simple, it might not have been. But if it's a simple solution ahead of time that people can take, okay, here are some mitigation actions you can take for climate change or for climate adaptation, then people might listen a bit more to that. But it has to be coupled, or else people, like psychologically, we just bury ourselves off.
Let me just add that, you know, there are historical examples of this too, not just in the current environment weather era. Why did, you know, my parents are Holocaust refugees. They're some of the fortunate few who managed to escape from Germany before the Holocaust. But why were so many unable to leave? Some were physically barred from leaving, but many others didn't leave because they didn't believe the warnings. It can't happen here. It's not going to happen to us. And so there's a whole psychological behavioral element to reacting to even the facts that are right in front of your face. And that's, I think, partly what we face in this era, too. Although I agree with Chad's comment that it can be made if you have a practical solution. And the, you know, the evacuation route is clear and not blocked, and you won't lose your home by evacuate, or you think you won't lose your home. You know, obviously that can matter as well.
Yes, gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Dale. I'm an independent contractor. And I was wondering how we can better address the relative vacuums that come up during these periods of climate change or uncertainty, especially surrounding natural disasters.
Excuse me, what do you mean by vacuums?
Vacuums in terms of order or traditional response through the emergency medical system, 911, and relative unplanned occurrences, such as through evacuation response.
A lot of the sort of novel or unique disasters, it really depends upon how resilient the community already is. The big difference between having flooding in New Orleans or Fargo, North Dakota. In the ability of the individuals to take action and just say, we have to look after our neighbors. Now, I live in the Balkans right now. Neighbors don't always get along with one another there. And that's a huge issue for us whenever we talk to security forces about disaster planning, because there's never any assumption that the central government will get there in time. And you can rely on your family, but not necessarily your neighbor. And so there's going to be a lot of contextual differences between, okay, if you have a community where everyone knows each other and they trust each other, there are a lot of bottom-up responses that people have in terms of disasters. And people, like a lot of the myths about looting and order breaking down often don't really exist under most disaster situations. People really do pull together. In the places where they don't, that's going to be really hard to plan for in advance. And it comes back to the communication issue. I can try to push, like the government of Kosovo, to say, look, include this in your defense planning. Make sure you have this or this. But it's also stuff they don't want to think about. I'll tell them, look, you're living in an earthquake zone. No. Those happen in Skopje. They won't happen in Pristina. Just because they haven't happened recently, right? So it's like the historical record. We'll just rely on that. The other problem is when those systems go haywire. So you all heard about the Hawaiian emergency response system sending out warnings about an imminent nuclear attack in Hawaii. Now that's a really interesting, horrifying if you were there at the time, sort of case study about not just when things go wrong, but also one of the problems that Hawaii had was, say, tsunami warnings. And it's the same like where I grew up in Wisconsin with tornado warnings. You get so used to them, you ignore them. So the more warnings you get that are false warnings, the more that people will not follow them, right? So we hear tornado warnings in Wisconsin. The first thing we want to do is walk outside, see if we can see the tornado. So we have to sort of build response into systems that really reflect the society and the communities there. But we also have to understand that we can't give too many warnings and we can't work too hard on it in a way that people just become inured to it, right? That they just become numb to it.
Miriam, can I ask you from your perspective, where do you see the kind of the next steps for research or the new areas that if you were going to, and I'm not putting you on the spot to do it, but if you're going to do another book or you're going to do another project, where would you suggest people focus their time and attention?
Actually, I was going to talk about that.
Go ahead, please do.
Anyway, at the beginning. So we do write about this in the concluding chapter of our book. When we were trying to decide where to go next. I'm not sure if it's going to be another book, but we certainly do plan for more scenario work. And we know that the abrupt environmental changes are going to occur in areas that are already unstable. So we came up with 3, Canada, the Arctic, and Antarctica. So we linked Canada, we'll look at Canada as 2 main regions. Of course, there are more than that. But we would like to develop scenarios for the Pacific coast to consider issues such as the melting Arctic in the north, as well, in combination with Canada's energy experts' policies or broader political engagement in the Pacific theater, combined with environmental hazards such as tsunamis and earthquakes, and then kind of see where that leads us, where are the critical vulnerabilities in that region. And then, of course, the Arctic, and not just, so the scenarios could look at not just the shipping routes and energy experts, but also things like impacts on the Aboriginal communities, especially in terms of food security. And then Antarctica, we don't really have much on that. There was a driver that we have, or drive, like, you don't really talk about the drivers, Chad, but so we did consider in one of the earlier, or some of the earlier workshops, we consider Antarctica and the melting of the Antarctic ice sheets. And back in the day, it was kind of a, this is not going to happen until 2050 or so. But now we know that the Antarctic ice sheets are melting at about double the speed is about doubling every 20 years or so. So it's likely going to melt much faster than Greenland. So we would like to make scenarios considering the Antarctic melt, as well as kind of this geopolitical, the geopolitics of the region. So currently the Antarctic region is governed by a treaty from the 1950s that limits signatories to doing research in the area, but some countries might be kind of thinking more long-term and trying to assert claims in the region. So I think it would be interesting to have a scenario that combines these two areas and probably some other ones. So to look at what cascading impacts can we see if we look at the melt and the geopolitics, and probably some other risks or other considerations that we haven't thought of yet.
Some other questions from the audience. Yes, please, over here on the side.
Hi, I'm Janice Brumman. I work at the Exchange Office of the Department of State. And we have many projects where we invite foreign experts in disaster management to travel around the country, our country, for 3 weeks at a time. And they see that we don't necessarily do things the right way either, but in many countries, in many places, the capacity of disaster or risk reduction is so limited. They may be a scientist in charge of their whole nation's disaster planning. And part of the communication problem that they have is like, how do they prioritize and tell the policymakers what's first? Because if it's a health outbreak, if it's transportation infrastructure, in your planning, who makes the final decision, or in your scenarios, where does the buck stop? Because I think that's what our visitors struggle with. Who's going to actually decide what's important? Thank you.
That's answering is probably a good example of how we use war games and simulations. Part of that comes down to training of the people who'd be involved, and also to simulate in what might be the case. So, for example, we set up war games where and they're described in the book, but sometimes we'll do a fictional country, sometimes it's a real country. But take an example from this past semester. It was a fictional country, island country in the Western Pacific, and it was exactly what you said. The country was dealing with multiple things at once. Tsunami warnings, typhoon warnings, flu outbreak. It was caught between territorial disputes between China and, supposed to be protected by the U.S. All these things happen, and it comes out that no one is obviously in charge of these things. The defense minister says, well, that should be health, and then, health says, well, no, but the Americans said they were going to send someone in, and, the Americans forgot to send someone in, so the Chinese said that they would. It's good to simulate that stuff in advance. We know that at least in the Pacific Rim, the U.S. Pacific Command has a program called MPAT, which we describe in the book, which is meant to do a bunch of different disaster scenarios and to try and get countries to practice and then decide, okay, who really would be in charge in these different areas, and not just within the country, but also so that someone in Tuvalu knows who in Fiji they would call in case that something would happen. Or that people from the U.S. are familiar with people in Japan. So you're not like looking up the Rolodex and saying, well, who am I supposed to call about this? You know them personally already. And that's one of the really important aspects of the work that doesn't get emphasized enough, is the personal relationships. That a lot of this is really based on trust, and trust between people. And if the experts are just throwing data at something, then it doesn't work nearly as well as if you have people, scientists really sitting down with the policymaker and just describing one-on-one what's happening. And that's why those exchange programs, I think, are really valuable as well.
Sir?
So my name's Kelly. I'm a freelance consultant. But just taking this scenario that we're talking about right here and putting it in a country which has a vertical management structure where one person runs the country, and you start working on scenarios that talk about change. How would you handle that? Because I've seen that happen where you start talking about things could go wrong in the future, and it's really tamped down saying, no, if that happens, then the person in charge might actually change.
Yeah, it's a difficulty when you start asking challenging questions to a government. I won't say that's what happened with Canada, but Canada's an example, because I can speak because you're still an employee. Right, I mean, they have their climate and environment policies, and they have their energy policies, and they really don't match up.
Yeah, you are
so,
right.
and it was the same in the U.S. as well. I mean, you start asking
And
really
they're
difficult.
supposed to match up. Sorry, they're supposed to align. We're supposed to be working together. But yeah, sorry.
Okay, sorry. My perspective as an American, I'm a Canadian permanent resident, but hopefully they won't take that away for asking this.
Sorry, go on.
No, but I mean, even in the U.S., we were asking questions about, well, should you really be doing deep water drilling off the, coast of the southern U.S. around methane hydrate formations? And then like a week later, Deepwater Horizon happens, and people get really kind of upset about that. So yeah, the danger is that people will clamp down, and they will in advance identify, we don't want anyone to talk about these issues. And in my past research, I've seen this, where certain countries that otherwise you would think are very environmentally friendly, who will specifically say, no one is to do research on this topic or to do any ecological research in this particular region. So they just avoid these difficult questions.
So Kelly's being very modest. Can you talk about your experience in seeing that in the field in these post-conflict environments where raising inconvenient questions creates problems because it may threaten the legitimacy or the ability to stay in power?
I think that is the question. I mean, I've seen a similar kind of work that you've been doing, as I understand from the book, being done from a more United Nations perspective, coming in and trying to look at how to plan ahead for 10 years or 20-year horizons in terms of development of a country. But inherently, it comes down to how is the country going to change? And the discourse that often goes on is empowerment of communities to take action to address their problems. In most cases that I've worked on are related to natural hazards, floods, droughts, et cetera, et cetera. But as we've seen in Central America decades ago, the idea of empowering communities, particularly indigenous communities, often puts them in conflict with the power structure. And therefore, you end up in a situation where, as Fred Cooney talked about in Central America, they were helping communities recover from disasters, and those communities then became targets for anti-opposition attack. So, I mean, that's just a very local scale kind of issue that comes up. But you also come up with, well, who's going to be the next president in the country? What's going to happen in 20 years? Is the president going to continue? And eventually people understand those questions, even if they're not asked. And so you might have a very good discussion, very good workshops, nice report, but nobody's really going to move on it until the person in charge says we want to move on these things. So it's a different perspective on engaging the scenario process, but then trying to figure out how you communicate that to somebody one or two people who might be running the country. Somebody in one country referred to, for instance, Vietnam is a party organization, whereas other countries are a person in charge type of organization. And that may be different ways of dealing with the scenario outcomes and how to think about how to actionize it, rather than saying, oh, we've done a nice scenario and come up. These are problems you probably already recognize, so I'm going against what you told us not to present a presentation.
Well, no, but I asked you to, because you've been sitting up here before talking, so I wanted to get that experience, because I do think, we certainly have plenty of evidence of poor response in the wake of disasters leading to declining perceptions of legitimacy of the government, and part of what then becomes fodder for protests. So, the governments are quite right to see communities as potentially very critical of the responses or failure. If the center, as you say, we're not going to count on the federal government or the national government, then straight away that's part of a critique that it goes. So it's not surprising that they're sensitive and want to censor it or set it aside as a separate non-political issue. Are there any other questions? I think we've quizzed these folks for a while here. I urge you to pick up Disaster Security, Using Intelligence and Military Planning for Energy and Environmental Risks. It's just now available. Chad and Miriam also kindly wrote a short version on New Security Beat on our blog, so you can go from the meeting to the short version to the long version and get it. I'm sure we'll have some tweets and photos that you can get the 140 character. Well, it's now more than that, right? It's not just 140. But we really appreciate all the work that you have done for years, literally, and then thank you for actually writing it down. Not everybody gets around to doing that. And urge this diverse audience to grapple with it and take some of these, certainly still questions, but some insights and tools, and be open to finding potential solutions and partners in some untraditional avenues for collaboration that is happening more, and we see that here in this room often, but a lot of room to grow in terms of doing that. So won't you join me in thanking our panelists today for the discussion?